lived in Sarasota
Uh,
and some places south of there. I mean, the median age is about 70, but other than that, it's wonderful.
well, that's Florida in general. In
Yeah.
fact, if you're young, you're pretty much guaranteed to get in trouble.
Yeah. Well, it makes you feel like, look how young and virile I am compared to everyone around me.
Especially in Sarasota. Oh
Mhm.
man, I miss the oranges. When I was a kid, they used to have them all over the place. I don't even know if that's the same anymore.
After I forget which hurricane it was, if it was Charlie or what, I know that a huge, huge, huge number of the groves that were in central Florida basically got wiped out. Then a year or two later, they got hit by citrus canker. And so, yeah, I don't know if they've even quite recovered yet or not. All I know is that when I go to the grocery store, 80% of the oranges there are all from California. So it's interesting.
That's horribly depressing.
Mhm.
Is Charlie the one that hit Punta Gorda back in like
Yes, yes, it is. Yep, yep,
2004 or something like that?
yep.
Yeah, that was my last hurricane.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
graduated from the University of South Florida. I'm like, I'm done.
Oh, yeah, that's cool. I graduated from the University of Florida, so,
Yeah,
that's cool.
I know. That's one of the reasons that I was interested in talking to you is that, well, one, you're a homeboy in terms of where you're from, Florida. And
Uh-huh.
then secondly, your range of short fiction is amazing.
Oh,
You primarily work within the horror genre.
yeah, I think that's fair to say.
What brought you there?
Um, it's just kind of part of who I am, I guess. I don't know if it happened because of kind of how I grew up. My family situation wasn't perfect, and so we kind of compensated by basically making horrible things kind of funny. And so it's kind of like living like the Addams family a little bit. So I don't know. I think that's kind of I've just always been drawn to. I don't write horror quite the same way other people write horror, and I don't view it the same way either. I kind of think of it more like I don't know, kind of like an ambiance or something like that. And I'm definitely not someone who just kind of revels in it, or like sometimes you'll read a horror book or a horror short story that's just steeped in like these people live horror. I just visit there and then get out and come back in, and I like when that's kind of normal life is tinged with unusual and weird things. Is probably if I had to name what I do, that's probably
It,
it.
it definitely seems like you have an affinity towards Lovecraft too.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I don't think any horror writer can quite avoid at least a little bit of influence that, especially if you're white and male, since he was basically talking to us. So and as soon as you start, as soon as you get involved in reading horror, you eventually stumble upon Lovecraft, and s- you know, if you're happen to be the right demographic, it kind of speaks to you for a little while, and then you kind of find yourself sort of inching away, oozing away, perhaps, because you're like, lots of lush descriptions, which are fun, and lots of really neat, very intricately detailed stories. And then, you start reading for other things. So I don't know. I don't, I haven't kept up with a lot of Lovecraftian fiction now, although I know Laird Barron and I know he writes really amazing stuff, and people like Livia Llewellyn and other writers who are working in that tradition but kind of stretching it. I think it's absolutely great. But I discovered Lovecraft basically at the University of Florida Library, where I would go late at night. And on the fourth floor, I think it was, of Library West, it was just this old back when the building, but before it was refurbished, just really narrow aisles and flickering fluorescent lights and stuff like that. And I have no idea what made me pick it up, but there was a book, The Outsider, and others, and it was one of the original Arkham House editions, and it just, I started reading it, and it was just the perfect, like, that's how you're supposed to discover Lovecraft, in some creepy ass library somewhere, So, yeah.
Oh, what a great story! And I don't remember where I discovered Lovecraft at. Probably the board games that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
since it
yeah,
became
yeah.
public domain or whatever. So
Hmm.
you're went up on me. I didn't even know that. What was it called? Army of Darkness was a Lovecraftian
Oh,
story.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's, when I think before. I don't know, probably the last 10 years or so, maybe a little longer, when you discovered Lovecraft, it was kind of underground. It was kind of weird and like made you feel a little icky to read it and find it. You know what I mean? Like, it was
Hmm.
kind of this, and I don't mean to, that totally sounds very hipster of me, like, hey, I liked it before everyone else. But it was, back before it was, well, obviously before it was in public domain, but also before it was so cheap to republish things. It was hard for you to find an edition of Lovecraft when I first. I mean, like you had Arkham House, and I think Pocket Books had put out a couple of paperbacks that were, not perfect editions of it. So yeah, it was kind of, if you got into Lovecraft, you had to be like a Lovecraftian hero to find
It
it.
kind of sounds like you're giving the internet credit for his resurgence.
Oh, well, yeah, two things: the internet and probably cheaper publishing. When you could
What do you
publish.
mean by cheaper publishing?
Well, what I mean is, I don't know. I think as time got on and technology improved, I think it was easier for even regular publishers, traditional publishers, to say, hey, you know what? We know Lovecraft is not going to fly off the shelves, but we can risk smaller print runs because the costs are better. We don't have to, we're not placing a gamble on something that, we got to print in 500,000 copies. We could just, yeah, you know what? He's Lovecraft, he'll sell whatever a little bit. And so they could take that risk, I think, when it was harder to do that, when the technology was not quite as digitized and all of that. But that's just my theory. I don't know for sure.
No, it's interesting because it's true. People can publish, and
Hmm.
publications can, put their work out there a lot cheaper than they did in the past. In fact,
Hmm.
there are so many. I mean, it's really strange if you think about the collections out there right now that are kind of struggling because they're kind of, drowning in a sea of other publications.
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah, but I mean, that's the double-edged sword of our whole situation, right? I mean, you've kind of got that, on the one hand, you have just an embarrassment of riches. On the other hand, you also have an embarrassment of garbage. So you're like, oh man, how do I find this
How
stuff?
do you find it? Yeah, exactly. How do you swim to the top? How do you pull yourself away from the other people out there doing the exact same thing you're doing?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's, it can be a little discouraging, because again, I sometimes joke with some of my writer friends. I'm like, it was so much more fun to write when I just thought it was me working alone. Like when instead of going to conventions and stuff like that, when you basically, it was Writer's Digest and some other things, and you were blind submitting stuff to
Mhm.
magazines, and you could just imagine, oh, it's just me and 10 other people, and then you go to a writing convention now, and you're like, oh my God, this is
Yeah.
this is what I'm competing against,
I think, it's because nobody has jobs anymore. Nobody has an actual career.
That's true.
You're
They're like, hey,
fantasizing about, the next Stephen King or whatnot.
how hard could it be?
How
Yeah,
hard could it be? Exactly. Dan Brown did it.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Man, so I mean, I mean, you're not self-published. All your stuff
Mm-mm.
is through an actual publisher.
Yeah, mostly through Lethe Press. And they do. It's, named for the river of dreams and memories, and so, you know Steve Berman is the publisher. He specializes probably two-thirds in, kind of forgotten or, not well known, you know gay, lesbian, fiction. And then he also does a lot of, just straight, just weird fiction. And so it's an interesting thing. He's very influential kind of in, gay publishing circles, but then I think, his books appear very frequently on the Shirley Jackson, nominees and Stokers and things like that. So he's got quite an eye. He's got a quite good taste in what he decides to publish. So.
Have you noticed that blending the two genres, the LGBTQ genre and horror fiction or fantasy speculative fiction, is helpful in finding an audience?
Um, I don't deliberately. I mean, like one of the stories in my new collection does have a gay protagonist, and I occasionally write that way. But I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Steve's got lots of theories about it, because I asked him. I interviewed him for I forget what website it was, but I asked him. I go, now that, when you started Lethe, it was a big deal to publish a gay book, and it's still kind of a big deal, but it's getting a little bit more accepted. I said, do you ever foresee a time when you don't need a Lethe press? I mean, not to talk you into retiring or anything like that, but
Hmm.
do you see the culture going that way? And he goes, there's always going to be people who are kind of forgotten and left behind, and and even as some folks get to be in the mainstream and get to be in the spotlight, others are still kind of lurking on the edges. So yeah.
The interesting thing though is that as mainstream as the homosexual community is, they still kind of are, treated badly by
Oh, yeah, yeah,
certain
yeah. No,
portions of the
there's
population, and
absolutely no question to that. Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, 100% not accepted. But
Yeah, no.
getting there, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
There's definitely
interesting.
been progress. So
So you teach creative writing at the
I
University of North Florida.
I have taught creative writing. I've actually haven't. I was an adjunct there for a few years, but I haven't taught for, I don't know, at least about a year and a half or 2 years actually. But that's just fine. I mean, it's definitely part of who I am, and when they need me again, like Batman, I will come swooping in for whatever course they have. They they, like lots of English departments, are discovering that it's hard to justify, you know, the number of staff you have when lots of your students are flocking to other majors and things like that.
Oh, is
So,
that the case? I got my degree in English
yeah,
too.
me too. Me too. Yeah, and so it was interesting to me, and remember being kind of puzzled by this, but as I was teaching there, occasionally we would have, lots of the students there were coming because they wanted like business writing and stuff like that, and so there were plenty of English majors, there were plenty of writing majors, although they didn't quite have a major, they had a minor. But it was interesting to me how their numbers were kind of going down. They were offering fewer classes, and eventually it got to the point where they didn't need adjuncts as much because frankly, they were having a hard time filling classes for the regular, full-time tenured people. So it was kind of
Interesting.
yeah, kind of that shriveled up a little bit just because, you know, first of all, Jacksonville is kind of a businessy town. It's not, there's some art here and there's some culture here, but it tends to be, this is where all of, lots of Florida's insurance companies and banks are headquartered and stuff like that. So a lot of people go to school with business on their minds now, I guess, at least here at UNF. So, yeah.
It's an interesting world that we live in. Everything is
Yeah.
turned over every 4 months.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You
No,
have
and
to show a
I mean,
profit.
I remember when I went and majored at UF in English, the department was so large. I don't think I saw the same people in my classes in the, the times that when I was an undergrad
That's
there. I'm like,
interesting.
like it was.
UF has a great English department,
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
a
No,
really,
they
really
did.
good one.
Yeah, yeah, they did,
I
and it
went
was.
to UF for a year before I ended up going back down to Tampa. And I
Mhm,
took the most interesting classes, like the study in
mhm.
comedy, from
Wow.
the beginning of writing through modern age. I mean, it was just an amazing class, and it was just one out of hundreds. It was so brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, they had extraordinary courses and stuff there that are, I'm sure they still do. I graduated in '94 with my undergrad, and they were kind of in a strange position of flux then, I think, because they were kind of they were leaning very heavily toward critical theory and not so much toward writing, and I know they've kind of recalibrated themselves in recent years, but
Did they offer a BFA?
they did. Yes, they did, and they offered an MFA for that matter. And I went. I What was so funny is when I went to college, my ego was so fragile about writing that I did not take any fiction writing classes as an undergrad.
Interesting.
I was terrified to do that,
Afraid of the
but
criticism, or afraid that you wouldn't be good?
both, both. Yeah, and so I wrote. Well, and also I had the big chip on my shoulder about writing genre fiction. Like, "Ugh, they won't
Right. I think
understand."
that's an undergrad thing because I had the
Mhm,
same situation.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, and
Though
so
I flirted with spec fiction in all of my stories, I never really crossed that line
mhm.
100% until after I graduated.
Yeah, and so when I kind of when I was considering going to grad school, I thought, oh, maybe I'll get an MFA, and I went to. It was a weird semester. It was one of my later semesters, and I had the way my credits worked out. I had to take one credit class basically get all my student loans and scholarships and stuff. So I took a class in fencing, which was fun and great, but for whatever weird reason, I decided to go talk to the then head of the writing program, and he was a well-known poet, and a fairly well-known poet, as well-known as poets get, I guess. And so I go to see this guy, and I am drenched in sweat. I'm like, I mean, it's Florida anyway, but I look
Yeah.
like a total lunatic. And I go in there, I'm like, I've got my thing on almost, and I'm like, hi there, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your program. And he looked at me like I had just kind of fallen from like the turnip truck, and he just kind of looked me over and he goes, what kind of fiction do you write? And I go, well, I write, some literary fiction, mostly tinged, as you just said, with a little bit of the supernatural. And he looked at me and he said, we don't do
Oh no.
genre. And I'm like, okie dokie. And so then I walked off. And what's funny is that, I go to conferences now and see all sorts of genre scholars and genre writers who have been to UF now. So, but in my day, they were still little fishy about it.
Well, that seems to be the main competition now. I mean, if I'm listening to a Clark's World podcast or something,
Hmm.
and I hear the credentials of their, artist of the episode or whatever, they're
Hmm.
usually in education. They're usually a professor of this school or that school.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, and I mean, it's kind of nice, I guess, in that, the old publisher perish chestnut now includes fiction, so that's nice. So you don't have to write,
Speculative fiction.
yeah, speculative fiction for that matter, yeah, and so you don't have to necessarily just write horrible, soul-crushing academic papers and things like that. But
Where does that put literary fiction, do you think? I
I'm
mean, am
sorry.
I just not seeing it because I'm not paying attention to it, or do you think literary fiction is kind of taking a back seat now to speculative works?
You know, my suspicion about that is that, you know, I think the more people have watched. Definitely, genre fiction is definitely very much in the cultural imagination right now and has been for, probably a couple of decades,
Right?
but I think that it's sort of like people have gotten used to a certain level of spice in their fiction, and I think it's hard to sell the stuff that doesn't have quite the same amount of spice. Like even mainstream books like The Goldfinch or whatever, those are books that don't have supernatural elements, but are written a little bit in a kind of experimental style, where it's clearly meant to be, you know, it's more focused on entertainment, less on self-expression, more focused on a little bit more focused on plot. There's definitely atmosphere and all of that, but I think there's definitely, I think the level of influence from genre fiction is a lot larger than people think it is, especially in the literary genres. They don't realize it, but they are writing. They're writing the way we do instead of the other way around.
It's interesting, isn't it? I remember back in the day, Stephen King would be, made fun of. He was a
Hmm.
hacker, this,
Hmm.
that, and the other thing.
Hmm.
And now you mentioned Stephen King, and pretty much right down the board, people are calling him a genius, and he'll probably go into history books as, the author of the 20th century or whatnot.
Yeah, if I could travel, if I could drop myself a message back in time, I would tell myself two things. One is, hey, you have anxiety disorder, take some meds for it. Number two is go seek out Stephen King, because again, when I was in my pretentious literary phase, I was one of those people who was like, "Oh, Stephen King," and I'm like, and one thing that opened my eyes is when I read The Body, out of different seasons, that completely revolutionized how I thought about writing and fiction, and I wish I had read it a lot earlier than I did,
Hmm.
because that would have made a big difference.
Anxiety. Does
Oh
that
yeah.
play into your fiction at all? Do you think?
Um, it certainly plays into my lack of productivity. But I don't know. I mean, I think that yeah, I think it probably does. I mean, I think that I was again, my childhood situation and various biochemical things going on have made me a little bit more um, attuned towards speaking and talking my way out of things and stuff like I've essentially been trained by my life to be kind of the sort of person who says what sounds true even if it isn't quite. So I was
Mhm.
basically trained by the universe to be a fiction writer. My father used to use that power for evil. I try to confine it to the page as opposed to everywhere else in the world. But it's funny that I think that I don't write about the kinds of anxieties I have, which are things like just not being places on time and stuff like that. But I think about I write about anxieties that are larger, and I think too the other thing, the way that reflects in my fiction is that I try to get to the deeper meaning of what scares us. Like I think there's a certain amount of, you know, pretty much everything, even every monster that we imagine has some essential anchor in our personality, so that,
Well, that's the
what.
best part about it, isn't it? When
Yeah.
you're writing about a monster, there's something
Hmm.
to key all of your energies on.
Hmm.
Whereas if you might have anxiety in your life,
Hmm.
sometimes it's hard to put your finger on exactly where it is.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. No, exactly. Exactly.
So I mean, I read the last post that you had in your blog about your mom, and I was really
Oh, yes.
sorry to hear that she passed.
No, thank you.
But in terms of her being a part of your life, it definitely seems like she was the perfect mom to have for a writer
Yeah, yeah.
growing up.
Yeah, it was, I mean, I had a very interesting combination. I had, in my case, my father, who has also passed away. My father was a very, very grimly practical. Life is hard. It's perfectly okay to lie and cheat and do whatever you can because everyone else is doing it, kind of thing. And he had the gift of gab. He was the kind of person who could, sell. Ice to an Eskimo, as the saying goes. Whereas my mother was very impractical, very dreamy, very, kind of, spacey, out there. He spent a lot of her time reading books and kind of hiding away. And so that combination in me, like being A, the kind of person who can communicate fairly well, and B, the kind of person who is contemplative enough to maybe have something to communicate about.
Hmm.
Like my father could talk the day long, but he wasn't that interesting, frankly. So whereas my mother, she was also pretty verbal, but she's definitely more introverted. But yeah, it was a nice, as weird as it was to say, I think that's a pretty good recipe to have, is, that one driving force inside of you that's like, yes, ambition, and then the other person inside of you who is like, well, I'd rather just kind of quietly read. So yeah.
I was reading about generations the other day in
Hmm.
terms of, where you came up and graduated college in 94.
Hmm.
You entered this world of, analog technology. You were
Hmm.
sending things out with stamps and on the envelope and a self-addressed stamped envelope inside the envelope. And,
Hmm.
your query letter was all printed out and you had to buy stamps and all
Yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah.
I mean, it's such an odd world to go from that to what we have now,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I almost threw away my first acceptance, actually, because I thought the magazine was soliciting me for yet another subscription. So
Oh,
I submitted a story to Weird Tales, which back then was edited by George Skithers and Daryl Schweitzer, and they had kind of, it was not quite the same as it was in the 30s, obviously, but it was a pretty nice magazine to be accepted by.
historical.
Yeah, yeah,
You're a part of that. I mean,
yeah.
that's so
Yeah.
cool.
And so, but what was funny is their publisher at the time, DNA Publications, if you submitted a story to them, you got on the mother of all mailing lists. And by God, they sent you something every damn week, it felt like.
Oh
And so I
man.
get this envelope, and it's a little heavier than the usual solicitation, but I'm like, ah, whatever. And I was literally was halfway through the motion of putting it into the trash. I'm like, that is a lot heavier than usual. And so I opened it up, and sure enough, it was an acceptance for that. My first sale was to Weird Tales, and so that was nice. But it was funny. That's a very analog story. No one would quite understand that now. That it's that it was having to filter out, what is actually going to be a real letter from some other person. Although that, I used to laugh too, that back then they had a form acceptance letter. Usually you talk about form rejections. They literally, the letter said, dear author, we are pleased to accept the enclosed story. Like, what? I'm like, I've been fighting for years to get this acceptance, and it's a form acceptance. What the hell? But yeah. Yeah.
Do you think it helps to go from, you had to work hard for that stuff? You didn't
Yeah.
know whether or not the submission actually got there. That was for me. I mean, I didn't really graduate. I didn't really graduate college until 2005, but
Uh-huh.
I'm sending stories out that way, and like you didn't know if it actually got to the place that you were sending the story to, because
Mhm.
the
Yeah,
black
yeah, yeah.
hole of
Well,
acceptance
you
letters or
would send
whatever.
a story and the place would go out of business while it's still in the mail. That's the
Uh,
other thing. And the other thing too, what that was really tricky was that, you'd go down to the library or maybe if you were flush, buy your own copy of the Writer's Market and flip through their kind of weird descriptions of the available magazines, and you didn't
right,
have the magazine to look at. So it was really, really hard to go, well, I guess they'd like this. Who knows? I
right.
mean, what's nice now is that, hey, do I want to submit to Nightmare Magazine? Let me go see what they're buying. I want to, I mean, you get a much, much better sense of what each of the venues is into than you used to. Like I was, and the other thing too was I was so desperate for publication. I'm submitting to, whatever Vampire Dance Story Emporium. I'm like, whatever, man, just keep cranking them out. I mean, just this, and so you have no idea if this is published in some guy's basement or, I mean, I don't know. So
Hmm.
yeah, it was kind of it was a weird time because you'd be like, well, I guess they sound cool. I don't know, and then you would get, it was nice too, though, was that, you would have like a relationship sometimes with that. Once you had seen someone's handwriting enough times and got enough personal notes, and no, it could kind of work that way. So,
It's so funny. Like the human is gone from that whole process.
mhm.
I know when I receive a rejection, I'm very practiced at that. I don't know if I'm actually. I don't.
I am too.
I don't know if I'm getting a rejection letter from a machine or from a real person. I
Hmm.
actually go back through and look at that magazines to make sure it's the exact same and there are no deviations to whatsoever. Like I'll count a deviation, like a missing comma. That is a
Hmm.
personalized rejection right there.
Ooh, yeah, somebody made a human error. Who knew? Yeah, no, I mean, although, it's interesting, as time has gone on and I get rejections still, I find myself, I know it used to be a huge honor to get a personalized rejection because it meant you were getting closer. I really am kind of getting to the point where clearly when people write personalized rejections, they're stretching to say something that's kind of friendly or whatever. And I'm like, please don't muddy the waters and make me go down a rabbit hole of how to fix this thing. I would be almost just as happy if you sent me a note that just had one or zero, that just like just an on or off
Binary.
switch. Really, I mean, it's horrible to say because I do, I like most of the people I submit to now, I consider to be friends, like Sheila Williams at Asimov's and stuff like that. But I mean, but so many of the other magazines, like I just give me an I or an A. It's okay. I'm not offended. It's I'm glad we have a relationship, but because so many times those rejections, I think there's this arms race of personalized rejections now, where everybody wants to prove how cool they are by, we give every single author a personalized rejection.
Ugh, yeah.
Sometimes the answer is just no. I just what, I don't know what to say about this thing. I'm not into it. So I mean, it's just like when
Right.
I was teaching.
It's not like
Sometimes
you're
I
going to
would.
respond to it either. It's not
Yeah,
like, politely you're supposed to say, I accept that rejection and go
yeah.
about with your life.
Exactly. And and so many times they'll say something I worry, like, I was always paranoid as a teacher of creative writing that, I first of all do no harm, and I was very careful about what feedback I gave because I'm like, the last thing I want to do is have you chase down some kind of idea that's going to take you away from what you're thinking, and I wonder how many people get those personalized rejections that are just kind of tossed over someone's shoulder that say, hey, I wish there was more character development. Ping, and that person and gets that and is like, oh my god, I guess I need to do, just suddenly goes out when actually the answer is that person just didn't like it. It's cool, don't worry about it.
Well, I
So
start thinking, what is character development?
yeah, yeah,
What
yeah,
does he mean by
exactly. Well, then you're
character
like, what are you
development?
talking about?
Let's
Yeah,
look up
well,
character development for
yeah.
3 hours instead of actually writing another story. Let's figure out what this meant.
Yeah, yeah. It's so, you're just like, I don't, that whole, rejectomancy kind of stuff where you're like, what does that mean? It just means they weren't into it. It's cool. It's
Strange
just,
Horizon.
it's all right. It's all right. I'm not
Strange
offended.
Horizon sends out a rejection letter that says this didn't grab me.
Hmm.
Pissed me off so
Yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah.
What do you mean it didn't grab you? What
Yeah.
did it need to be to grab you? I
Uh-huh.
don't know.
That there was the old when Gardner Dozois was the editor of Asimov's, he had, I'm guessing it was unintentional, but he had the most kind of the rudest rejection, like form rejection letter that basically said this simply failed to rise above the other 800 submissions we received. Good God. What do you what? I mean, yeah,
Cut to the bone
yeah,
until you get the next one. It's written exactly the same way, and it
yeah, yeah.
takes the
Like,
sting out a little bit.
you could probably have worded that a little bit better, but okay, that's fine. I guess it's okay to be honest. But yeah, that makes
I
me
mean, the
laugh.
cost of entry back then prevented the situation that we have now, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, having to spend money on stamps for that matter, but I mean,
Mhm.
also just the technology you had to, it wasn't quite as, I mean, before my time, I didn't. I mean, I never had to typewrite any of my stuff. My stuff was all on the computer. Sometimes
My
it was on
God,
a
I heard a story about Bukowski, how his penmanship was so perfect that he could typeface the
wow.
story and send it
You
in without a typewriter.
That's
Or
a
maybe
funny
that was
thing.
in factotum. I'm not even sure.
You wouldn't even think that about Bukowski because he seems like
No.
he's just kind of a mess. Like I wouldn't expect him to have perfect handwriting. But I mean, yeah, I mean, just all that. You know, when you had to, it was time consuming to sit down and put a piece of paper in a platen and turn it around and do all that. Or for that matter, hey, it costs a little bit of money to have a laser printer or whatever and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So.
So I mean, that's interesting point. Where do you see this field of ours going into the future with everybody and their mother writing fiction nowadays?
I don't, boy. Hmm, I
Is that a
don't
loaded
know.
question?
It is. Well, you know. It depends on what mood you catch me in. I mean, a lot of the time, I think that we're going to probably. I mean, right now, the great thing about the internet, and also the kind of horrifying thing about the internet at the same time, is this kind of democratization. Anybody can just leap in and do things, which is wonderful. But I think that what we're going to start seeing and probably need is a lot more kind of curation. I think we're
Mm,
learning that there are limits you know comment sections and things like that. There's definitely going to be, I think, especially as people begin to take the technology for granted, they're going to be like, you know what, I don't want to be in the giant Walmart of the internet. I want to be in this boutique and I want to spend most of my time here, and this is where I get the content that I'm interested in. And maybe it's, I think that's one thing you kind of see with podcasts a lot. You see that kind of, oh, yes, I'm going to, like I listen to, a podcast called My Favorite Murder about true crime,
mhm.
and it's part of a whole group of those kinds of things. And you could live your whole life and only listen to those kinds of things, and maybe that's limiting.
And
But if
pick your
that's what,
topics
yeah,
and pick
yeah,
when
but
you want to listen to it, and you
yeah,
can
yeah,
pause it and go about your life. And that's what's so
yeah,
wonderful about it is that you're
there,
not being drowned by other
mhm.
people's ideas of programming. You can program your own life.
Yeah, yeah, which is wonderful. I mean, they had there was an interesting experiment in publishing a couple of years ago called Great Jones Street. I don't know if you heard about it or
Sounds
discovered
familiar.
it, but it was basically a whole bunch of venture capital got together, and what they called it was kind of a Netflix of short fiction. And the idea was to have this giant ass, library of short stories that they were paying to republish. They did a few of mine, and you could basically browse it more or less by subject more than just even genre. Like you could say, hey, I like crime, I like serial killers in, New Orleans, and here are the
Mhm.
three, or whatever. And I do think that that's kind of a useful thing. And I know it's limiting because yes, you should broaden your horizons, and you should probably read more than you just
Well,
naturally want to. But you know what? There's so
reading in itself is an entertainment, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
people have a. I mean, if you're a reader, you're not really trying to broaden anything.
Mm-hmm.
If you're
Mm-hmm.
a writer, yeah, you're trying to broaden your strokes a little bit. But
Yeah.
readers just want to get off on whatever the hell they like. That's why
Mm-hmm.
romance is so big
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
people
No,
like romance.
exactly. And what the reason that romance is so big too is that it's a relatively predictable experience, but with slight variations. You
Slight,
know,
yeah.
yeah, very slight, and but they're important, and they're like, yes, cool. This is the same story, but now we're in the gold rush years, and now we're
Mm.
in Versailles, and now
And
whatever.
the
You know,
protagonist or the ingenue has blonde hair and not red hair this
yeah,
time.
yeah, whatever. And so, and I mean, I don't know. I think too the other thing that's changing with fiction is that because of the sheer volume of it around, there's definitely this strange idea that the customer is always right. And you see this in things like, you know, anger about like the latest Star Wars movie.
I know,
You made a story that I didn't expect, and now I hate you. What the hell?
right?
Time was you went to a movie and you didn't like it. You're like, what are you gonna do?
Well,
But
if
now
you're
you're
a
like,
Star Wars fan from way back when, you know
yes,
what it
I
was like when we were kids and we saw
am.
those movies for the first time in the theater and then whatever on TV or
Hmm.
videotape.
Hmm. Hmm.
We didn't really have a lot of choice.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
we gobbled up all the mythology that we could get and
Hmm.
we made up our own. And now people can have an opinion
Hmm.
about whether they hate the movie for some dumb reason. Because I gotta say, the original trilogy, they weren't perfect,
Yeah,
but
not
we
even
loved them
close.
anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and there's just a certain amount of, and that's what's interesting too, again, is that whole customer is always right thing. You had a certain level of trust, maybe not a perfect level of trust, but some level of trust that, hey, if you're making a movie, you probably are pretty good at it, I
Mhm.
guess, and I'll give you a little bit of benefit of the doubt. There is no longer that benefit of the doubt. There is that, you better make a movie that absolutely rings all of my bells, and if you don't, I'm coming for you. It's
Yeah.
basically what it boils down to. So it's actually kind of scary. You'd think to make a movie. That's why I see very few. Again, boy, this is going to sound so hipster, and I promise it's not. But I do so many like little indie kinds of movies because I'm like, I like the ones that are not playing for a genre or a fandom already. Where clearly every movie made by Marvel is designed to appease people who are waiting for it. I mean, it really is. They've placed an
Yeah.
order for a movie, and they're going to make it. And even the new
Mhm.
Star Wars movies, as much as I'm enjoying them, there's definitely, oh shit,
There's
we
a
better
little
do
bit of that
something for the
too.
fans. So that's what
You
I.
have to service them.
Yeah. That's what's so weird. Like, it's not, you don't get accidentally entertained anymore like you used to
No.
be, like,
The
when I,
unfortunate thing though is I'll go home after seeing like The Force Awakens or this last one or the Rogue One or whatever, and
Mhm.
I'll think to myself, "Oh man, that was such a great movie," and I'll plug into Reddit or Twitter and look at other people's opinions. It's like, "Oh, I don't
Oh,
know what a good movie is, I guess."
was I wrong? Yeah, yeah,
Shit, I have to see that again.
Well, that's what's interesting too is that, we've definitely perfected the science of making a movie feel good or seem good. We've got I mean, really, like all of those focus groups and all of the things we teach screenwriters and directors, this is where you have the big explosive musical note of
It's
drama.
true.
This is the
Movies
moment.
by math, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
basically what every screenplay course in the entire history of education is trying to teach you.
Yeah, yeah. So
Your
so
plot
we
point has to go here. Your exciting incident has to go here. If it doesn't, you fail. You're never going to get this thing made.
Yeah, and what's creepy too is that, it works. It's like when you make a pop song by Math, they know, yep, you've got to have a little bit of rising sound here, and you've got to have this, and I mean, and that's what's really kind of scary too is that, you know, you can make movies that make you feel like you've been through a great experience, and then 2 days later you're like, what the hell? That was weird, I mean,
Yeah.
and there's
Or you
lots of
can't watch it again.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah. You're
cannot
like,
sit
what was
through it
that?
to save your life. Why am I?
Yeah.
Oh God, I'm so bored.
Hmm.
What can you think of something that you've seen recently that kind of takes the wood and just rubs it against the grain?
Oh man. Uh, let me think. Let me think. Let me think. Um, hmm,
Oh, maybe that get back. What was it called? Get
Get
on?
Out. Get
Get
Out.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example, actually. Get Out is a great example of a movie that, pretty low budget, clearly not appeasing to an organized fandom of any kind. It
Mm-mm.
wasn't made for horror fans. It wasn't made for. I mean, it just made. Hey, here's a cool thing I made, you know. And I think that was he had a lot of freedom. And you know what? The sad thing about it would suck to be Jordan Peele now because now
Right.
movie number two comes out, and you're like, whoa, what happened to,
And
that
you
was
could
so.
see his kind of influence, his comedic influence in Get
Hmm.
Out too. And
Yeah,
you know
yeah,
that's going to show back up in the next movie that he makes.
yeah,
But
yeah,
will what he's trying to get at be as deep? Because
yeah.
Get Out had a lot of depth to it.
Yeah, no, 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 it did, and it was one of those movies that does actually kind of stick to your ribs. It's not a movie that you leave and you're like, oh, whatever. But you watch it, you're like, that was good, and then 2 days later, you're like, wow, that's still good. Who knew? That kind of that's yeah.
But it does stick within a genre though in a way. And it wasn't
Hmm.
like photographically interesting.
Hmm.
No, maybe it was when he fell into they call
Oh.
it the whatever. Well, that was an amazing little part
Hmm.
of that movie. What about fiction? Can we play that same game of fiction? Can you think of anybody that's written anything? I mean, you're a speculative author, so I'll
Mhm.
mention Kings of the Wild, which was really popular last year. I actually got a copy of it and read it, and the guy wrote every single fantasy trope you could think of into his book,
Huh.
but still wrote a compelling piece of fiction that pulled you through. I
Huh.
mean, he's not trying to be inventing, he's not trying to reinvent the fantasy wheel. He's just telling a story within what you know of as fantasy.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's funny when I do, you know, I sometimes do gaming with friends, and they always want to get these greater and greater complex games. When I'm like, you know what, I just like to play Risk with a slightly different map. I mean, where I'm like, I want to use the same rules, but let's just do them slightly in a slightly different situation. I'm trying to think of some books lately that I've been on a huge crime fiction tear. I'm listening
Mm,
to The Black Dahlia by James Elroy on audio, which is a fabulous book, you know, and I find a lot of my interest now is kind of, and same thing with what I write. It's basically crime tinged with weirdness and the supernatural. But I'm trying to think of what I've read lately genre-wise that's really been astounding. Sometimes I read short fiction, sometimes I read, trying to think.
I could think of two off the top of my head potentially. Seven Eves and then The Martian. They're
Oh
kind of
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
same
The
in
Martian.
terms
Yeah,
of
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
hardcore science fiction, but they blew me away.
Yeah.
It's hard to find books like that.
The Martian was just an extraordinary story of creation too, for that matter, where
Right.
he wrote it on his blog and stuff, if I understand correctly, and then.
The narrative that I have is that he wrote a short story called The Egg.
Mhm.
Have you read that?
Mm-mm.
If you haven't, just look up Andy Weir's The Egg.
Uh-huh.
It's like 800 words. It's nothing in terms of effort to read through, but that thing popped for him, and it basically was translated into 25 different languages. I mean, this is an 800 word short story, and it popped. And he basically started to form a community of people who enjoyed that story and was able to start writing The Martian with kind of like guidance from an audience.
Huh. Yeah, I have this theory that the reason Shakespeare's plays are so good was back then they didn't exactly write them out. I mean, they wrote some of it out beforehand, but what happened was that you wrote down what worked in front of audiences. So it's really the audiences of those plays that helped write those. He basically tried several different iterations and wrote down what worked, and that's how all of those plays are so fabulous. But um,
Uh,
but yeah,
com- uh, Hits by committee. I mean, we do
yeah,
that in Hollywood nowadays
yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been, a lot of what I read now are kind of there's a kind of a cadre of authors like Megan Abbott and Jennifer McMahon and Gillian Flynn who are writing. I mean, I guess the best thing to call them is just sociopathic woman fiction, but because I know so many
That's a big thing now, isn't it? What
so
was that movie
often.
with Neil Patrick Harris?
Oh yeah,
And
Gone Girl is a
isn't that the
movie.
same kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah, yes, yes, that's written by Gillian Flynn, and yeah, I mean, it's
Oh,
so.
it is. Okay.
And so I find myself so much more interested in the psychological speculation than these days than I am in physical or supernatural kind. Isn't that? I guess that's kind of weird. I guess too. I mean, as you age as a reader and a writer too. At least for me, I find that I'm way less interested in plot and far more interested in being given some other vicarious experience.
Right.
The
Right
reason.
now, in my writing, I'm very interested in death
Hmm, hmm,
and gods and mythologies and things of that nature. And I'm just trying to explore that as much as possible.
hmm.
Is there something like, I mean, you said psychological. What does that mean exactly?
I'm fascinated by writers like Philip K. Dick
Oh,
who talk about a lot about, yeah, exactly, who write an awful lot about what does it what what am I looking around at that's me, and what is my imagination versus what is actually real, and does it
hmm,
matter?
he's a very paranoid guy too
Oh
in
yeah, good
real
lord,
life.
yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He was an interesting cat. I just read a great book, kind of uh, I guess a philosophical biography of him called "I Am Alive and You Are Dead." It's
Mm,
by a guy named Emmanuel Carrere, and it's translated from French or whatever, but you can get it on Amazon. But yeah, it's a really cool. Like, here's his life, but by the way, this is where all of his ideas kind of came in. From his when he was born, he had a twin sister who passed away, and so he kind of thought that she was with him through most of his life. So it's just weird kind of thing. One of my favorite books of all time is by Patricia Highsmith, who wrote this who wrote the Talented Mr. Ripley books,
oh,
and
okay.
she wrote this great book called This Sweet Sickness, and it's a love story. You could read it, the first part of it, thinking, "Wow, what a sweet love story about this guy who's clearly enamored with this woman." But as the further you go along, you realize how delusional he is about his chances with her. And like he buys a house in the country because he knows she's going to divorce her husband and come live with him. And just this crazy, like you read it and you kind of you feel a little bit like icky at the end where you're like, what am I imagining about my life that I'm completely wrong about, and that's something that fascinates me a lot.
Have you written anything that people can explore those kind of motifs in the with your work out right now?
Um, well, I've got that collection coming out next month, Acres of Perhaps, and I guess a couple of the stories in there probably have a little bit to do with that. Like, um, there's one called there's the Leaning Lincoln, which is actually something that I wrote. It's kind of based on an actual experience of mine. That story is probably about 80% true, but it's definitely about kind of a young kid in the 80s who's kind of trying to figure out what his role is in his father's particular brand of evil and how much what can he do about it and kind of what's the role of his imagination in solving that problem. So it's kind of a neat kind of there's cursed toys and stuff like that, but I mean there's definitely this part where he's this is a kid trying to grapple with what can I control in the universe with what I believe, and it's kind of that's one of those stories I think that I didn't deliberately do that, but I think that's kind of shines out through that, you know.
Do you deliberately write, or do you accidentally write?
You know,
Do you know what I mean by that? It's like
yeah,
the
yeah,
whole
yeah. No, I do.
Panther versus what is it called? The other one,
Crazy
partner.
person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
crazy person.
Um, I definitely don't outline for shorter fiction. I should probably outline more when I write longer fiction, but what I find is I want as much out of my way as possible between me and the page. And generally, I write in kind of a strange, a little bit by ear, I guess. I guess the nearest thing would be if you told someone, "Hey, can you play this song on the piano without the sheet music?" And the person sits down and they're kind of, they fumble along a little bit, but then they finally get it. That's kind of how I write fiction. I can hear when it sounds right to me, I guess,
Mhm.
and I could be completely wrong, obviously. But a lot of what I write, I find the more I plan it, the more stilted and false it sounds to me, and
Mhm.
most of the things I've written, I have the cackle factor where when I'm writing something, if it makes me cackle with glee, I know I'm onto something, like this is some crazy shit, or
Right.
whatever, So I find, I have I've written couple of novels that have gone, not too terribly far. My agent has, trooped them around and stuff like that. And I think in both of those cases, I was so intimidated by writing a novel that I did outline them, and I was very careful about this is the third act and this is this
Mm.
thing, and it really I can't do that very well. So I think the next one I'm going to write, I mean, I can't completely pants it, I don't think. I'll probably have just a general sense of the beginning, middle, and end, but that improv is very important to me, you know.
I pantsed both mine. I don't think I could write anything else but a pants novel.
Yeah, no, and I mean, part of me is like, I don't know, I work, my day job, when I'm not teaching, I work as basically I write training materials and marketing stuff for companies, and a lot of that is very structured. And I'm like, if I had to write fiction in that way, that'd be horrifying, and I mean,
How do you
and
write fiction anyway, writing that stuff all day long? Do you find kind of your creative juices sucked clean of your
I used
soul or
to. I
whatever?
used to, but I work now with a group of people who are all very cool and creative, and they encourage, like I have somehow become the guy that they go to like critique their writing and also to write. Essentially, I am like, we need to write something that sounds convincingly business-like. Will, can you fake this for us? And so I write basically business fiction. so, so so it's
well,
hilarious. Is
well,
that
that's all marketing is anyway, isn't it? It's basically
Exactly.
fiction.
So it's this hilarious thing where I'm like, yes, we need you to convince people that our new website is awesome. Like, yeah, that sounds like fun. And I'm pretty amoral about like I don't really care if it is or not. I can probably sell it, sure, And since the same thing in
You have the
fiction.
proper vocabulary to make that work.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I mean, it's Yeah, I mean, it used to set basically what happened was I basically changed my attitude about it. For many, many years, I thought all I need to do to finally get writing done is to get out of working and get to stay at home and wear my pajamas and just do nothing but write all day. But then I realized that every person I know who lives like that is so close to poverty and horror
Mm,
that they don't have the concentration to write that. You know what I mean? Like, it was funny. I'd go to conventions and meet writers I admired, and they'd be like, "Yeah, I'm living with my grandkids in a shack and behind the house, with my Nebula Award sitting on a, on a windowsill, you know." And I'm
that's
just,
short fiction, though, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, short fiction. Although, I mean,
And novels too.
novels too these days. I mean, although when I used to tell my students that pretty much these days the smallest marketable block of a career is basically the novel. You can have a career writing short fiction. People like Kelly Link do it and things like that. But, essentially, until you write a novel, people are kind of like, yeah, you're okay. But they're basically they're biding their time until you write your novel. Even people like Laird Barron and stuff like that. They're like, oh, where's your novel? And hell, Kelly Link, for that matter, who's written, untold number of really brilliant stories, and she's working on a novel now, and that's what everyone's like. So, where's the novel? What have you done for us lately? You know.
What is it, do you think, that drew you to short fiction? Was it just the education? 'Cause I would imagine you got the same education that I did, and short fiction was what was required to be written in every single workshop.
Oh yeah, and it's definitely easier to teach. It's definitely easier to rely on students to get their asses into
Same
it.
structure.
Yeah, yeah. Basically, I think for me, I the ideas that came to me tended to just be little mind experiments. What would happen if this? And that just doesn't, in some cases, that doesn't sustain a novel. So a lot of the
Mhm.
times I would come up with an idea. One of my early unpublished stories was called The Werebum, about a guy who is giving money to a panhandler who gets bitten by him and slowly becomes a vagrant throughout the story. And it's this weird, silly,
That's
experimental
good.
thing that I wrote
Love it.
that it's just
It's
kind
a
of,
good idea. That's the kind of stuff that kind of works if people find it, and
mm,
that's the hardest part, isn't it? Directing people's eyes to that story.
mhm. And
Did you
yeah,
publish it?
no, 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 I never did. Like that was one of my, I mean, it was not super well written. That was one of my very first ones in college that I started flogging around. But I think, yeah, it was definitely a little politically incorrect too, for that matter, I guess. But it was also just this kind of, yeah, it just wasn't, it wasn't good. But I mean, but it was definitely one of those ideas that, you know, I like that jolt of electricity, of recognition of an idea, and it's really hard to sustain that through a novel, you know.
Mhm. That little spark of creativity
Yeah,
turning
exactly.
it into a bonfire, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you've had an interesting career so far. You're what, 13 years into your publication? You're like actually getting stuff out there underneath an audience's eyes?
Is it really? Yeah, I guess it was. I mean, I sold my first
14
short
years, something like that,
story. Oh, well,
2003?
yeah, that's when it appeared. I sold. That's what's hilarious is, yeah, it came out in 2003, but it sold in 1999. Isn't that crazy? So I had
Wow.
this.
So how do you sit for 4 years knowing a story got bought, but it's not showing up? Do you have like
Yeah.
conversations back and forth, or is there like an editorial process that happens? Like, oh, hey, we got the story again. We don't like chapter 8 or paragraph 8. Would you fix that?
You know, I always joke that if any other business behaved in the way that publishing does, they would they'd be out of business. I
Well,
mean, and so it's
publishing is going out of
well,
business,
that's
though, isn't
exactly
it?
true. But I mean, what makes me laugh too is that all of these people who are doing, especially genre stuff,
Mm.
we do it for the love. So yes, we're not quite doing it to professional standards. Like that's why you should do it. If you love it, you should be doing it better than this. But what, al- what was funny about Weird Tales at the time was that the two guys who ran it were kind of spacey, science fictiony nerd kind of guys who were like, "Oh yeah, we'll get around to it." I mean, they were just kind of, yeah, well, there was no editorial. They had no edits for me. They had no feedback, particularly. They were just like, oh, let's just file it away. And if we ever have a spot in the magazine that is exactly 4 pages long, we'll put it in there. I'm like, good Lord.
Well, interesting. Probably works that way across the board too. I mean, well, a lot of stuff is getting published just electronically now.
Hmm,
There's
hmm.
no need to worry about the staples
Yeah, yeah,
or
which is
whatever they
exactly,
did back in
yeah,
the day.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so I mean, what do you think? You've got a book coming out in a month,
Hmm.
collection of short stories. How many short stories are in there?
Um, Depends on how you count one. There's 5 short stories, and then there are another 5 episode descriptions because one of the main story in it, the titular story of Acres of Perhaps, is about a Twilight Zone-like TV show in the 60s
Mm.
that was actually a lot edgier and stranger than the Twilight Zone, and so I included a couple of little stories that are basically episode synopses of that. So it's 5 traditional short stories and 5 kind of, I guess they'd be kind of like flash fiction kind of things.
And you're going through your publisher.
Yep, yep, going through Lethe Press, and yeah, that'll be. Just, you can pre-order it on Amazon or whatever. But yeah, it's
Leffe is so familiar to me. I must have seen them and looked at
mhm.
their wants. They have a magazine too, or no?
They used to do oh, what was it called? They did a magazine of gay short fiction. What was that called? Damn, Steve will be so mad at me that I can't remember it.
But
Icarus,
they only
Icarus. It was called
publish
Icarus.
gay fiction.
Hmm.
It's interesting.
Gay
That's
speculative
that's
fiction.
probably why it's stuck in my head because I
You're like,
couldn't send
wow, that's
anything.
pretty isolated.
Like,
How that doesn't. Who's
wait.
the market for that? Yeah, yeah.
So what does it look like after you publish a book? It's
Mhm.
obviously been through a bunch of back and forth between you and the publisher, but what is your place now in terms of what's your job when it gets published?
It's interesting. My last book was called In Search of and Others. And when that came out, I did a huge amount of, hey, I basically did like a little mini tour. I went and a couple of friends invited me up to speak to their college classes. And I did a book launch at a bookstore here in Jacksonville and all that stuff. And it had zero effect. So I mean, well, I mean, like books sold, and whatever, but it really, and it's and maybe the book just doesn't connect, or I don't know, but whatever extent, it sold, and it sold okay, and I was happy with it, but there was no uptick in, oh yeah, wow, this was clearly a huge thing. I mean, just because what, so many books are premiering, so many books have these same things, you know my job, I'm sure, again, if Steve was here, he'd be telling me my job is to go out and knock on every damn door, but my job at this point is to, I go to conventions, I speak on panels, my philosophy of it, and it's probably a deadly one in this environment, is that, I just keep trying to win over readers a couple at a time, and that's just kind of the only real way you can do it, because everything else feels so forced to me. I hate all that networking. I hate all of that stuff, because
Yeah,
at the end of the day, most of that networking is I'm selling myself to people who are also selling themselves,
I
you
know
know.
that's what Twitter feels like to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or you go to a convention. I am always depressed at a convention. Unless I'm there with a friend and we can go off and do whatever. But when I go to these conventions, and I'm just like, every single person here is this aching black hole of want,
Mm,
and it's just this, hey, would you buy my book? I'll look at your book if you, and like, and it's just so
yeah, somebody made a
horrifying.
joke about that on the Pete Holmes podcast,
Hmm.
where the future is basically an economy of everybody's art.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I kind of wanted to write a short story about where there's a guy who's so in demand because he's the one person who still reads instead of writes.
That's not going to sell anything at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
He's
yeah.
got
That's
$5 in his pocket to buy a copy of your
Yeah.
book
So they
too.
just chase him down like he's a wounded animal. Yeah, I mean it's just so
Poor
and
guy.
yeah, it's so
It's
I
like
do.
what was it, the dangerous game, but
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, with Count Zaroff. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's I did a reading. I did the international uh, uh, conference for the fantastic and the arts a couple of weeks ago, and I did a reading, and that's my one of my favorite things to do, because I do a reading. I sit on a panel of people. We do a mass reading of 3 or 4 people, and everyone in the room is not there for me. They're there for someone else. And I'm okay with that, because what always happens is that I do this reading, I put my all into this reading, and afterwards there's always some person who's like, "Who the hell are you?" And I love that. I mean, it's probably, again, not a great marketing strategy to be the "Who the hell are you" guy, but I kind of like that in a weird sort of way. I kind of like the you came out of nowhere. I like the fact that I just keep coming out of nowhere because the nice thing is that no one's expecting a huge amount. They're like, oh, where's your next book? I mean, God forbid you're Kelly
Yeah.
Link, who's everybody's waiting with bated breath for this novel. And if there's anything wrong with it, you're screwed. In my case, they're like, who's this asshole? And I'm like, I'm the same asshole who was here last year and the year before, and the year before that.
I just
Like
have a news story. Shut
yeah,
up and listen.
yeah, exactly. That's what's so funny to me is that, and the weird kind of memory gaps that people in the genre have. Like, oh, hi, nice to meet you. I'm like, yeah, I literally have shaken your hand in this exact spot in this exact hotel the last 10 years, buddy. So I'm always amused by that. Because people are so already looking over your shoulder at the next guy. So.
People say that, I mean, I heard this term the other day, and it actually stung because, like, oh man, who can, get a different classification for themselves? The whole world is basically defining you. The term is like cult of the amateur, basically, where
Oh.
everybody and their mother is producing something for other
Hmm.
people and nobody's getting paid.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
professionalism is lacking as well.
Hmm.
And the theory is that eventually those people will just go away because there is no benefit to it, except for
Hmm.
the people who are sitting down and actually putting craft into their work.
Hmm.
Those are the ones that'll be left standing.
Yes, but how long until the others filter themselves out? That's the other thing. It's one thing when in a more difficult art, like hey, are you playing the cello? That takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of
And
whatever.
not only that, but you instantly know whether the person's a good cello player. Like
Exactly.
immediately, like 10 seconds, you're gonna know whether or not
Hmm.
they're gonna enjoy listening to that.
And
But
so
as
that's
opposed to like our work, people have to engage,
hmm
like
and
use their brains in a
yeah.
non-passive way.
And they have terrible taste most of the time. So a lot of the time they're just like, "Oh, that sounds good to me," or whatever. I mean, and they just say it's such a weird thing. Like it's easier to delude yourself for longer as a writer than it is in most arts. Like you can look at, like, if you're a sculptor and you're like, man, that does not look like a human being. I've really fucked that up. Then
Mhm.
done. You're kind of like, well, I need to do something. And a writer, it's possible to go a very long time thinking you're a genius and everyone else is an idiot. But when you look at your sculpture and you're like, that does not look like a human form. I know that. So it's funny. You could be self-delusional much, much longer.
It's interpretive. It's supposed to kind of look like a human.
Hmm.
No, it's very true in terms of craft. I mean, do you think that, I mean, you're an educator or you have educated
Hmm.
people. I mean, what would you tell your students going out into the world that we're living in right now? How would you prepare them for this daunting task of finding eyeballs?
Anytime, and what would always happen at the end of my classes, and I don't know if this is a compliment or not, but always at the end of my classes, the last class of the semester, at least two students would walk up to me and they're like, I'm switching my major to English because of you. And I would always go, don't put your karma on me, man. Take that with you. I mean, but what I usually told them and would still tell them is the the only hope, the absolute only hope you have, it's not glad handling, it's not going to conventions, it's not going to New York, it's not shaking hands. It is totally your only hope is to combine something deeply inside of you, your personal experiences, the things you've seen, with other things in the world. It's the only hope you have for originality is combinations of things. You're never going to pick the one thing that's like, yep, this is one isolated thing that's just brilliant and I've knocked it out. Everything is combinations, and the thing that you have that's special is your whatever the hell your weirdness is. And the weirder you are and the weirder you look at yourself, the better. Because I used to
Mhm.
have students all the time who would come up to me and like, am I too screwed up to be a writer?
I
And I'm like, you're barely screwed up enough to be a
was
writer,
gonna say you
you know.
might not be screwed up enough.
Yeah, yeah, or that I did also have students who came to me and like, I've had too boring a life, and I'm like, well, first of all, be careful what you wish for, and number two, your life is not as boring as you think it is. You've got plenty of things that have happened that you've just shrugged off, and other people would think are extraordinary or bizarre. You know. So yeah, that's what I always tell them. I mean, I used to when I did critiques, I was definitely the shine on you crazy diamond school of critiquing, which is, hey, I don't quite think this is entirely working, but I don't want to tell you too much to drive out what makes this original and cool. Make it more like that and less like that, and I think you're in business. I was definitely, you know, I think too much critiquing can really cause a lot of problems. I think all of, you know, I think I honestly think that 90% of what happens to people as writers when they get burned out or when they write terrible stuff comes not from taking fiction not seriously enough, but from taking it too seriously. That's what freezes you up. That's what makes you self-conscious. That's what makes you afraid. What basically boils down to is the less you think about it, the better off you're probably going to be. The less you worry about it, the less of a big deal you make it. You know, when you,
I would add the more you work too, the more
yeah, yeah,
work
of
you
course,
do.
of
Yeah.
course. And the less that you're looking at your feet when you're like, when you go out to be a lumberjack, when you go out to do any other normal thing that requires some kind of skill, you don't. You try at your hardest not to think too hard about
Yeah.
every motion you're doing.
I watched a GIF of a dude about 200 yards up a tree chopping the very top of it off. You
Hmm.
imagine second guessing yourself in that circumstance. I mean, you're basically dangling over certain death,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
chopping
yeah.
down the top of a tree.
Yeah, you
I
hit
mean,
one bad knot and suddenly you've got a
done.
chain whipping in your face. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Read somebody say, have no grammatical mistakes in 10,000 words. That's the biggest thing that freezes me up on a daily basis, and it's not even remotely close to death.
Hmm.
And it's fascinating. We've been talking for about an hour and 5 minutes, and I
Oh,
feel like we've barely scratched the surface of potential topics here.
so when does the podcast begin? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, we're going to start here in a second. I end the thing with three questions, and the first one would be, how do you advise somebody to get over themselves and produce art? And I think that your answer you already provided. I think that was genius.
Hmm.
My second question would be, what are you reading right now that you think people should be taking a look at? Anything on your Kindle, on your night table that you just have to recommend?
Probably the big thing is I've been reading James Elroy's The Black Dahlia,
Oh,
and he is just a maestro with the kind of cool noir lingo of the 40s in LA that is just amazing. And yeah, it's an older book, and yeah, it might not be something that every genre reader should read. But I honestly think if you're someone who likes working with words, you should definitely read this book because just it's like watching a master play the piano. You're like, oh, okay, cool. I may not play that same kind of music, but that guy's really got his fingers on the keys and he's really jamming. Yeah.
I've not read it. I've wanted to read Helter Skelter. I know it's a totally different author, but
Yeah, Bugliosi, yes. Yeah, I just read that again. I read that every so often actually because I just love that is actually one of the best written true crime books. Also, Zodiac by Robert Graysmith is probably one of the better written true crime books. That
what
is
did
just
Truman
us
Capote write?
in cold blood.
Oh my God, that was so good.
Yeah.
That
Yeah, that's the
was
kind
so
of
good.
book where, you read that the first half of that book, you're thinking to yourself, "Hey, I could be one of these victims." Second half of the book, you're
You
thinking,
could be
"I could
one of
be
those
one of these
bad guys.
yeah,
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 it was
that's
such a good book.
that's a genius talent
That's
to
the
have."
only Truman Capote book I actually read cover to cover, and it was just one of those. It sucked you in. It was so
Mhm.
compelling.
Mhm.
So yeah, Helter Skelter. I wanted to read just because what's his face just died.
Mhm.
His life was a curious one. I mean, I love being able to take a bad guy and kind of break their life apart, so you can kind of see how the nuts and bolts kind of work.
It's funny that in the last 90 seconds you've mentioned both Truman Capote and Charles Manson because in one of the stories in my upcoming collection is called Night Fever. And in that story, Charles Manson is released from prison 10 years later than he would have been, not 67, but 77. And he becomes a disco guru in New York instead. And so instead of being helter skelter, it's night fever that he's preaching. And he spends time at Club 54, which is where Truman Capote was. And he becomes obsessed with Truman Capote's fame and all of that. So, yeah, yeah. That's a story in the collection that it's
Would
so
he
funny.
get obsessed with Truman Capote though?
I'm sorry.
Would he get
Oh,
obsessed with Truman Capote though?
well, part of it was because he was someone who was so well respected and like listened to by the people at the Club 54. Is basically he was the easiest mark he could find that would still listen to him because he was unusual and outre and stuff like that. So yeah.
Interesting time,
Hmm.
really incredible time. I was watching what was that show? Fargo.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
They were back in the 70s in their second season, and there was just a simple scene of a husband and wife sitting in a living room with magazines on the table. And I just started thinking to myself how how much I'm like completely in my computer or my phone all the time reading Wikipedia. I wouldn't imagine living in a life where you have an analog phone. Magazines would be enjoyable.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
anyway, I mean, this is a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Where can people find you on the World Wide Web so they can engage with your books and your writing?
Probably the easiest place is just my website, which is will-ludwigsen, LUDWIGSEN.com. You can also just search for me in Google, and you'll find a couple of things that have appeared lately. I've had a story that appeared in Nightmare magazine and things like that. But yeah, my collection is Acres of Perhaps, and that's coming out next month.
And you're strictly by invitation at this point with your publications, or are you querying also?
Um, I do occasionally query, but I right now I need to be focusing more on novels, and in that case, I have an agent, and she's waiting very patiently for me to pony up with another book. So that's my big thing right now.
Thank you so much for being willing to come on the show tonight and just talk to me about your
Yeah,
career and writing. And it was a lot of fun.
yeah, I had a great time. Thank you very much for having me. It was a blast.